we're now live. But I'm going to wait till the little red bar finishes. Okay, so here's our fifth chat, and today is about what is it to run a campaign or creating a campaign or even write a campaign. So if everyone could start off and do an intro about themselves, that would be great. Steph, you go first, then Bill, then Paul, then Dwayne.
Sure. My name is Stephanie. I have been playing RPGs for about 5 years. I have run games and prepaid, I don't know if I call them campaigns, but series of scenarios. And I'm excited and intimidated to create my first campaign, and I'm looking forward to asking lots of questions today.
My name's Bill Best. I've been playing, like Steph, about 5 years. My GMing has been limited to pre-rolled scenarios for the most part. Looking to kind of expand that further from one-offs. And overall, I think my playing has been in scenarios where the GMs have written a good deal of it. So interested to hear about kind of pre-rolled campaigns versus not.
And I'm Paul Dorpling. I am a longtime DM and player, 30 plus years of role-playing experience. I've played everything from modules to making up my own campaigns, short ones, multi-year. It's run the gambit. So yeah, been in the trenches.
I guess that's my turn. So similar to Paul, been doing this for a few decades now. I think we're up to 31 years of playing and running games, and there would be some campaigns in there, although we'll get into this a bit as to where an adventure or a scenario ends and where a campaign begins, because sometimes it can be a bit of a gray area. So we'll looking forward to getting into that today.
Thanks. I'm Eric. I've been doing this for 3 decades. I love playing lots of different games. So Dwayne, let's take on what you just said. The adventure, the scenario, and the campaign. In your head, what does that mean?
Well, adventure and scenario to me are almost synonymous. Scenario is a more general descriptor, I guess you could say. It's more of like a you pull at the flavor of it and there's your scenario. It's just describing what it is. Whereas an adventure, well, then you've already got that built into the word of what that already means. Now, as to the length of it, that's where it gets a little dicey as to what I consider a campaign and what's considered an adventure. If you play for 10 sessions, is that a long adventure or is that a very short campaign? If you play 20, that's probably more likely of where the gray area is. Long adventure, short campaign. And that's the area that I like to run games in, that sort of range of about 20 sessions or so, which could take up to a half a year when you're playing it out, which is what we typically tend to do in our current incarnation. So yeah, it just depends how that is defined. Some people have these year-long campaigns or several years long, as we'll probably hear from Paul, who's had some epic ones. And I guess there's another way of looking at it too, in that if you keep playing the same game and you're just meandering and going into different scenarios and playing out different stories within that, but it's not actually designed to be a campaign per se. There's not like a beginning point and an end point. A lot of times role playing is just sort of meandering around, and then you find a story here, you find a story there, you have encounters. So that's another gray area of if that is considered a campaign or not. So just a lot of different ways to look at it.
Cool. Paul, what's your perspective on that?
Similar to Dwayne's, I think that scenarios or adventures tend to be short and they contain generally a single goal that can be accomplished in 1 to 10 sessions kind of thing. whether it's the classic, rescue the princess, or destroy the Death Star. There's a single goal, and you play that out, and then it's over. Whereas a campaign is a longer narrative arc where you end up having characters grow and change and develop, and the stakes get larger as you go along until eventually you reach a kind of a natural conclusion, a climax, like a book, like a good novel, and then you wrap it up. And that to me is it's the story element of a campaign that makes it different. And Dwayne touched on this, the idea that if you're just doing one-off scenarios and they're not linked in any way, then you're playing a sandbox. So you're keeping the same characters, but you're not actually playing a full campaign, in my opinion.
So one word you introduced there, and I'm going to clarify, is session. So in our head, sessions are, I run a group around a table, all virtually, for a number of hours, 2 to 4 hours, 5 hours. And you could have multiple sessions in one scenario, just for clarification. So Stephanie, Bill, what kind of questions would you have about, like, you're at this stage, you both run scenarios. What do you want to know about running campaigns as opposed to running scenarios?
I think I'll start. It's interesting, Paul, the way you were describing that, because for RuneQuest, I've run a whole bunch of scenarios and we've done a lot of sessions. I don't know how many, but I want to say like 10 or more. But it never felt like a campaign, and I wouldn't call it a campaign because I was linking together different, just different short adventures or scenarios without an overarching goal that the players were aware of, or storyline that the players were aware of. And so I think the thing that I find, well, a few things that I find most intimidating about creating my own campaign, the first one would be, I'm a lot more comfortable now, running a short story, but you have to create enough. We've been talking in our videos for a while about how you don't want to write everything word for word because the players are going to change it, and it's interacting back and forth, you're building the story together. So how do you build an overarching campaign that is going to change partway through? That's the part I think that I find the most intimidating.
That to me is the illusion of the campaign. So if you're doing a pre-written campaign, so I ran D&D's Out of the Abyss. Very clear storyline. Everybody had already kind of pre-bought into it. We knew what we were doing. Let's put that aside, because those are easy. But if you're creating your own campaign from scratch, I think that you're right. You can't plan everything out in detail, otherwise the characters are on rails. The trick is, and this is where the art comes in, is that you write single stories that slowly build together a narrative, right? Without, you may have an overarching goal of, okay, eventually they are going to fight the dragon at the end, kind of thing. And you as the DM know you are leading them in that direction. And the characters feel like there's a narrative, but it's not necessarily explicit from the get-go. And that's the evolving story that they become involved in, and they can shape it. So yeah, do you have to have I know the exact plot line all the way through? Heck no, I never have. But that's tricky. I'd love to see Dwayne's take on this, because he's a little different than I am.
Well, and I want to jump in because having played RuneQuest with you, it felt like there was an overarching story there, whether or not intended, right? So from a player perspective, I just assumed this was all predetermined, and you kind of had an idea of where things were going to go, and the fact that we just kind of fit into it gracefully, hey, that's great. But to hear that you each one of them was a distinct separate event, I think tells a lot about the GM to say that they can weave these things together.
I appreciate the word graceful. I'm glad that it felt graceful. It didn't feel graceful in my head. So I'm really glad that it came out that way. And I would say that I started to sort of formulate an overarching story in my mind about halfway through. But we've been playing for 12 sessions. That's after the 6th session. So that's really an interesting piece. I definitely had it in my mind that you plan most of this ahead of time. So Dwayne, do you want to set me straight?
In terms of the planning part, you mean?
How do you plan for, create, write campaigns? What does it look like?
I think it's changed over the years. When I first started out, so we're talking a few decades ago, it would be more of like the sandboxy type that Paul mentioned, where we were younger, so we had a lot more time. Like we would play for, a 12-hour session would not be out of the question back then. So we would just play and we would sort of meander around. We would, play different scenarios that were sort of like bumped together back to back. And there might be some general through line of, connected characters and, the past can affect the future and there's consequences and stuff like that. But there probably wasn't something planned that was overarching. Now, as I've sort of done it over the years and, time becomes more of a constraint and just trying to have that storyline be a lot more tight, I guess, because of the time limit. I like to plan things out a lot more now, at least for that particular session. But in terms of the overarching story, I keep that sort of general. I have some things that I like to have in there and be like, okay, well, this person is going to be doing this at some point in the story. This thing over here will probably happen, although it's malleable. Maybe that thing could be changed. So I do have some definite things that are in there, and it's like moving around different pieces depending on where the players go and how they deal with it. And sometimes those pieces come off the board because it's the players have changed the story. So I try to be as open as possible. Anything that I've written or anything that's been played out becomes canon in the story. So I don't like to retcon anything unless there's something really egregious or if something along those lines. So I try and be as flexible as possible and try and make the story have agency for the characters. So when they do change it, they actually feel like they're doing something and they're accomplishing something. And I've told them that what they do can actually change like the actual plot line of the story. And I like that because I think you get a better story out of it because now everybody is actually creating that without feeling railroaded. So it's a bit of flexibility back and forth. There's some things that I want in there, although how the players react, I will change those things around. And like I said, some get dropped, some get added. And then at the opposite part of that, I like to improv it and do things on the spot and be more reflexive and reactive in it. So it's a push-pull that comes in, but it doesn't happen overnight. It just takes over time learning different ways of doing it. And that's just my preferred way of doing it, how I've learned. Everybody's going to have a different way of doing it. And that's the fun part about being a GM. And that's why I like playing other people's games, because you get totally immersed in how that person is running that game. And I think it's a very good idea to have many different people who can run games. If you're relying on one person all the time, then it becomes a harder thing. It's harder on the person running it, the GM, but I think it's hard on the players too, because they're all staying in that same sort of culture, I guess, at that particular table. Whereas if you have different people, you can actually change that culture depending on the game, and then more people feel involved in it. So that's kind of my take on it, I guess.
I think so one of the things we've explored is the defined versus co-creation of a campaign. One of the things I've seen kind of like at some point something gives gravitas or gravity to the game you're playing. And in my head, it's usually shared characters. The shared character can be the tavern, the town, the spaceship. It could be a ship, like an actual ship as opposed to a spaceship. But I think shared characters are a good way to start producing a hook that actually the campaign is continuous. And I think we've seen a lot more games start to do that, whether it be Ars Magica with the Covenant, or even Numeria with its community, or Corollas and its starship, or even Mega Traveler. Your spaceship is probably going to be the thing that kind of like keeps you together exploring. And the stories can be entirely different, because particularly if it's a movable thing, it can go wherever it wants. So I think like shared characters are something that allow you to build a faster campaign, if you like, that people then actually reflect more on that as a more important thing than their own characters at times.
In my most recent game, I literally used this as the giant lever to get it moving. It was literally come save the orphans. People were being called back to town because the orphanage was going bankrupt, and the church needed them to raise some funds and save the children. I mean, it's hokey, but it got the characters to buy in very quickly to, we have a shared goal and a shared mission. And then that became the orphanage became a character that they became very protective of. And anytime I needed to kind of jolt them in one direction or another, it's like, oh, let's go get the magic sword over here. I'm like, yeah, those poor orphans are starving. Yeah, you can go get the magic sword, or you can go do this. And you could watch them fight with themselves between like the greed of the characters and the overarching storyline. So yeah, creating something that's permanent that they keep coming back to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gives a great reason for them to keep going.
Plus, if you give it a name, then it becomes even more of a character. Paul, in the last game that we were playing, what was the name of our ship? The legendary, was it the Walrus? Legendary Walrus?
Yeah, the Legendary Walrus.
Yeah, so automatically you give it a name like that, and it's already got a personality to go with it. And you think of movies, and you think of the Millennium Falcon, and it's got its own personality. You think of even something like the Vacation series and the Griswold car. That's a personality in and of itself. Little Miss Sunshine, the VW bus, the DeLorean, the Ghostbusters car. Like, all these things have personalities, and they're all built into it. So working any of that stuff into a campaign or an adventure, it helps out a lot, I think.
Oh, wait, you missed the most important one though. Barbarella's all shag carpet spaceship. Come on.
Well, yeah, that was I thought that was a given, really.
So you guys touched on something that I think kind of ties into that, and it's for me as somebody who mostly has spent their time playing and has been thinking about how do I go from like one-off scenarios into a campaign. One of the things that kind of defines campaign to me is that there is a world that is operating with or without me. There are characters in this world. There are people that are recurring. They have power. They are there, whether I like it or not. And I will keep bumping into them. And same with like the Millennium Falcon, like it keeps showing up. It's always there. It is permanent in this world. And I guess I'm going to pick on Dwayne a little bit. Like, I don't know how to necessarily decipher that being just an adventure that builds over time and these are recurring characters versus a campaign. Like, I don't necessarily know that there is a good answer for a strict definition there, but that's kind of where my head's at.
Yeah, I don't even think it's necessary to actually have a definition of it. Whether it's a long adventure or a short campaign, it's still got some of the same elements. You have an overarching story, you have a beginning, you have a middle, you have an end, you have common characters. So if it just basically comes down to length, then there isn't really a big difference in my mind. And just as long as your story works out in the end, and the fact that everybody has fun and it comes to some sort of a conclusion, that to me is the main thing. I wouldn't get hung up on the definitions as much. They're kind of rough definitions. I don't think there's an actual, like, you play 50 sessions, you're now in a campaign kind of thing. But yeah, I would say don't get hung up on it. Just concentrate on the story and just having fun in that sense. But it sounds like you've got all the elements of what that would be.
And I think you bring up a good point, Bill, that one of the magic pieces of a campaign that I've experienced too is encountering reoccurring characters and feeling like there are adventures and politics and crises that are happening viscerally around your characters. And it's the fact that it feels inevitable that those things are going to happen no matter what your characters do that has made some really cool campaigns in the past. And that's probably another thing that had me feeling intimidated about creating one, but the takeaway message maybe that I'm getting is it didn't seem nearly as together, like maybe it wasn't nearly as together as it seemed from the GMs, that it was sort of like, okay, we're going to bring back a character and we're going to create a backstory for what they've been up to and go from there, rather than assuming that it's been in the back of their head the whole time.
Bill made a good point earlier that your scenario, Stephanie, felt like a campaign from the player's perspective. I think the players fill in the gaps of the narrative very well and help build that out in their own minds. The DM doesn't have to do all of it. And yeah, so I think that's maybe a takeaway too, is like, don't sweat it too much, because it can develop on its own very organically.
I think there was one time I was playing one of Paul's Dungeons and Dragons campaigns where I said, do you mind if I draw the town? He goes, go for it. So I drew the town, put it into ink and everything else, and the town came alive. So again, you don't actually have to have all of this weight on your shoulders. When I think of a lot of TV, it all starts off very episodic. They introduce you to characters. They may give you some background in those characters, but it takes a little while until they build arcs. There's some exceptions, like say Babylon 5. They had lots of arcs already, as opposed to, I know, Stargate, it just felt like they were just going to another planet. And eventually it became very powerful because there were callbacks to characters and callbacks to different planets. But that took a while. So I think the important thing is to not think of this as this big, heavy thing to get you started. That said, and I think Dwayne implied this, that sometimes it's fun from a GM perspective to write a story that you want to tell. I did one for Guardians where we're playing Mega Traveler and you're on basically protecting Earth. And I knew maybe one-liners. I had about 15 different hooks of areas you could go to. Again, a bit like a sandbox. But I didn't know which path you were going to take through that campaign. And I think you don't need to have so much. You can usually tell the scenario before which way players are going to go. And that usually then gives you time to write something up to kind of add detail and depth. But yeah, I mean, that's, I think one of the things that also talking about callbacks is escaped villain, is somebody that manages to get away that then starts to cause havoc for you. Or, and the players will usually tell you if they want it or not. Oh, damn, I really wanted to get that goblin, orc, or whatever else. So I think actually having characters that have intent. And there's one thought I have here. When I started in Dungeons and Dragons, it was really about killing monsters, grabbing treasure. That's kind of what it was. And you went from one room to the next room and everything else. And eventually, the creatures started to have intent. They had their own agenda. They weren't just goblins sitting in a cave. They were going somewhere and they were going to do something. That's when it gets really fun as a world, that everybody has an intent and a purpose. And it doesn't matter if they're a monster or they're a human. I think then that starts to create you the politics and the government and everything else that kind of starts to overlay over a period of time.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves is a dungeon that makes no sense. Like, why on earth is on one side of the hallway there's a room with like 4 kobolds in it, and the other side of the room there's a ravenous beast of some kind? Why doesn't the ravenous beast cross the hallway and eat the kobolds? Like why doesn't that happen? Being able to think of your ecology of your world as well as your dungeon makes a lot of sense, because yeah, otherwise it doesn't hang together. Pet peeve. I will move on because we're off topic.
I will add about the character arcs that we were talking about earlier. If you want character arcs for all your other characters, or at least some of the other characters, including NPCs, because like Eric said, they all have their own motivation. You can have them have arcs, but you don't even have to plan them beforehand. You can get 10 adventures in, 10 sessions in, and then realize, oh, if I brought this one character back, that would be an interesting character arc. So it's having all these different pieces on the board, and then depending on your story, you can add them in and you can create those arcs. And then, it might look like you created that from the beginning and be like, whoa, 10 weeks ago, I had no idea this is the arc. Well, you probably didn't know either. It's just, you just came up with that. And, that's sort of the magic of storytelling there, is that you don't have to have all this stuff laid out. depending on what happens, you can just bring those pieces in, and then these arcs, kind of create themselves in a way, because you can see where their starting point is, and you can just create that endpoint and just bring them in.
To say, in one of my campaigns, I had an NPC who traveled with the party for a little while, and they were basically kind of a minor character, but then they split up. The NPC went back to town, and the characters went off and adventured for a long period of time. And when they came back, that character had taken over the Thieves Guild, right? So all of a sudden, there was like, wait a minute, that person, did they have why were they with us? And it completely changed their perspective on what happened in the campaign. And also, is this person now my ally or a villain? And we can get a nebulous kind of character in there who they already have a relationship with. Now you've got a whole new story arc you could potentially spin off. So there's fun stuff like that. But I agree that sometimes those characters take on a life of their own, and then they help push your plot along. And you can keep using them because the characters have that relationship. Nothing quite like coming back to town and that person you done wrong in the last adventure is sitting there, bad-mouthing you in town. What do you do? Do you call them out at high noon and shoot them down in the street, or do you do something else? It's fun.
Yeah.
But that could be a single scenario, or it could spin off a whole different campaign arc.
Yeah, I think the other thing when we think of campaigns is that we often want to do different things inside them. So a variety of things, whether it's kind of follow a character's background story, or whether it's kind of exploration, combat, investigation, crafting, like using all of those and like saying, could I, like this person says that there's a lost sword, but maybe the sword's now in 3 parts. And maybe like I can give clues over a period of time that will allow them to find out that actually it's completely destroyed. Oh, but they maybe have found something else. So understanding what each of your character wants also allows you to kind of create arcs, because they're very individual arcs for that person. And it may be, oh, I want to learn this spell. I want to do right by my God, or I want to rebuild this forest. So there's always material to pull in that gives you that strength of holding it together. What other questions, Bill and Stephanie, do you have?
I do have a question, but before that I had a comment, because it's interesting playing with you, Eric. You always give your characters really distinct goals. Like, I'm going to find my family's lost sword, or I'm going to search for this kind of artifact. And I feel like you've described that that's really helpful for the GM, because now you can be pulling inspiration from the characters. And I find so far, just as a new GM, I find having my players create their own goals really overwhelming and intimidating, because I'm trying to juggle this pre-written story, and I'm trying to put in slightly few elements to make it, mine and interesting. And wait, now this character keeps telling me they want to find this magic sword, and I have no idea where to put a magic sword, or like how hard I should hide it, or how the number of times I tried to write a fun little poetic clue for your hidden sword, and I've not had the inspiration to write something that I liked. I find that really overwhelming. I assume that does become easier once I get the other pieces more manageable with practice, but I'm really enjoying watching Paul shake his head right now.
You just don't care. That's the important thing as a GM sometimes. You can't care about all the things.
I agree with you, Stephanie. That is the absolute hardest thing. When you've got 5 characters who all have or 6 characters at the table who all have different backstories and different motivations and are trying to accomplish different things, and trying to wrangle them and a story, that is difficult. That's one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the detailed backstory. And also the problem is that if you try to build your campaign around a character's backstory, the danger is that now one player is key to everything that happens and has to be there every night. Or 2, every other player is like, well, I'm not actually a key character. I'm just a sidekick to that Yahoo, and I'm following their storyline. So I would say that that's one to be actually really cautious of. Fair warning.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because that's actually built into the 7th Sea game, which I brought up before as one of my favorite ones to run, where rather than characters leveling up with experience points, their goal is like they create a story in parts that they have to try to complete. And so we haven't really done that way because I've just been doing scenarios. But if we were to build a campaign, you know, the way characters are meant to be built, you're integrating 5 different people's individual goals into the story. So that will be an interesting adventure.
I think you already do that, Stephanie, in 7th Sea. So my archaeologist, and we said, oh, there's an artifact that controls a very big monster, the Leviathan. Do you think your character would be interested in that? I'll go, yeah. it's history, isn't it? So I think that actually not thinking about that you're writing an entire scenario for one character, it can be a hook. It can get you into a room, and the room may not even be the right room. But it could be the reason why, oh, you're kind of going to like help you go along on that path. So I think I like 7th Sea's kind of like agenda around that. Like they actually, you have a major goal and then minor subplots to it. And that's all you really want to do as a person, because it's kind of human.
I think I'm realizing too the importance of that shared community or ship or whatever. It's the hub for the spokes that are the story, right? So like the campaign can exist in tandem with some of these side plots. They don't necessarily have to directly fall into the campaign storyline. You know, every once in a while you take a break, you take a day off and you go do something else. That can be the side story for that one person too. I've never actually worked it in that way, so I'd be curious to see if any of the other GMs in the room have, but.
In terms of, you mean working?
In terms of working the kind of, so those backstory elements into the story, as opposed to having them directly involved or directly impacting the story, having them just kind of be side stories that are happening in tandem with.
What I would do in that instance is I'm kind of like Paul in that I don't like the detailed backstory, because then you can actually create part of that backstory as you go through it. But having some of that stuff, you know, you want to have some things there, some kind of motivations, but you can also work with the player if you're GMing to say, well, you know, maybe this won't work for this particular scenario. Can we change it a bit to more fit into the storyline, so it doesn't just feel like we're just wedging in this extra storyline that is completely different than what is going on here. And if you work with each person that way before you start, then it might be a little bit easier to actually fit those storylines in, and to make sure and to have everyone feel like they're being heard. And then you're working on it together. You don't just get handed this 5-page manuscript detailing their background, and you know, it's like, well, that's not even close to where my story is, and the person's goal is like, I don't know where this is going to fit in. And so shoehorning things in where it doesn't fit, there's nothing to say that as a GM you can't go to them and say, can we change this a little bit to fit more in the story, because it'll be to everyone's benefit of doing that. If it's perhaps a larger campaign where you're going to have like several different adventures within there, maybe that gives you a bit more flexibility. And maybe in this one particular adventure within that campaign, you don't focus on it. You focus on you know, 1 or 2 other characters' backstory. And then the next scenario within that campaign, you focus on some other character's things. So there's different ways of going about doing it. But I would just say, just try and work with the players rather than having to shoehorn everything in. Because it'll make things enjoyable, I think, for everyone, and feel like everybody's heard, and so that it fits into the story.
It's interesting because this would be a topic more for the talk we had in the past with becoming a GM. But I think because I'm a new GM and I have run games with new players, but also like very experienced. Well, Eric's played, I think, most of the games I've run. So that's one person playing for decades and has been a GM for a long time. But I've run for a few people who are more experienced than me. and it, it never really occurred to me to be like, hey, this character element isn't really going to work. Can we talk about this? I've always sort of taken it like, well, they know what they're doing. They're more experienced than me, so I'm going to try and figure this out. So I appreciate in some ways doing that, like permission to challenge players, and work with them, obviously, but sort of to say like, I know the story and this is not going to totally fit. Can we rework this a bit?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing as co-creation. When you're co-creating the actual adventure, you're playing it out. You're doing that together as a GM and a player. So I think as a background, it should work the same way, and that to fit that into the story, you're working with them, and it actually creates something I think a lot more interesting as a result of it. And you're actually doing discovery in there as well. It's not just everything is laid out. Well, there's nothing left to discover. Now you're discovering it together, both the background, the present, the future. So I think it makes it a little bit more exciting and engaging too.
It's funny if you work with characters like that or players before the adventure starts and you find out you were actually fundamentally on the wrong page, that may not be the right campaign for that player. If that player wants to play an epic romance kind of thing, and you're like, but every other player at the table wants to do dungeon dive and hack and slash, maybe that person's a bad fit for that particular campaign. And that's a kind of harkens back to the players conversation we had a while back. But yeah, but again, you find out that right at the beginning before you enmesh them, in, and then it gets messy because campaigns can go on a long time.
And on the flip side, it could affect the opposite way too. If you have a very creatively thinking player who's thinking outside of the box a bit, but trying to make it fit, as a GM, you might go back and say, hey, that's actually a pretty good idea. That might make it actually a more interesting story. Let's kind of go with that. So there's the co-creation of that back and forth of working with the players, and just to see what you can all come up with, and what's sort of agreed upon the best story and most engaging.
I think it's important to always co-create the characters with the players. I think every single time I've seen it go wrong is because the player has gone off, built the character, tried to understand the system from their perspective, not tried to understand what game you're running. And the way out of that is to, what is the real thing you want here? What is the thing? Let's boil it down rather than creating all of these spells, all these guards, all this turret, all this kind of stuff. What is the thing you're really after? And helping them get that within your world. But I think Paul's comment is absolutely valid in sometimes that people want to play different types of games. And understanding that, I think, is very important. If people just want to kill things and do experience and that's what they want, or they come straight from computer gaming and they see the world as a sandbox and it doesn't matter how many times they die, whereas in role-playing it does. I think understanding what they want. I think for the bigger campaigns, I would always co-create with the individual. I'd have a session 0 or -1 for each character, and we'd agree what they're building and how they're creating it and everything else. And that will often give me lots of inspiration about, I could do this, keeping it in my head and everything else. But I think that's very important because there's always going to be players with experience that are going to try and play something that may be too custom for the game that you actually want to run.
You make actually a good point, Eric. I mean, the idea that it's funny, if I was playing with people I'd never played with before, and it's been a long time since I've done that, because I have some pretty stable gaming groups, I don't think I would start a campaign with that group. I would want to run a sandbox session, a one-off, a short scenario with that group of people to get a feel for what they like and what they don't like. And that might be a great way to both introduce the world, the concepts, before people become too wedded to a character creation design or long-standing goals.
Yeah, I tend to do that also for new games. Like when running a game, I'm only going to do like scenarios. I'm not going to really think about like where are we going and everything else, because none of us know really what this is like. Or different editions, the same with that. I think it's play, see what it's like, and then kind of see if this works.
It's funny, we've talked a lot about the start of a campaign. The one thing that I would want to throw out there is ending a campaign. I can't tell you how many campaigns have either not ended or ended very badly.
Yes.
Ending a campaign is really hard. Lots of games just fizzle out, right? That is the most common end to a campaign. People's lives get busy, they can't play anymore, somebody loses motivation and can't run, people move away. Oftentimes campaigns fizzle before they end. Being able to know that it is coming, knowing that that you need to end the campaign becomes a very interesting thing to think about.
Or they have a child, Paul. Bill.
Sometimes that happens.
Yeah, I would say
And it takes a long time. Yeah, it takes a long time to grow them into characters. It's really that's a long campaign.
Having some sort of ending is crucial. I think. I think when you had sandbox stuff, back in the day where you're just kind of meandering around, those often didn't have endpoints. Sometimes they fizzled. Sometimes they just continued on, and there's no real endpoint. And those can be fun for what they are. So if that's what you like and you just like exploring and having encounters and stuff like that, there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm getting a lot more satisfaction out of having definitive endings for adventures. I want to know, this is the end, this is the wrap up, this is the climax, conclusion, all that stuff. Just like Eric, we were talking about with having a television show or a movie. You want that ending, you want that finale. Maybe you go on to another game after that, but wrap it up. What I do now is I actually tell people approximately how many sessions that we're going to play. If it's going to be 20, then I say it's going to be around 20. And even as we get to the end, I sort of do a countdown and be like, okay, we can wrap it up in 3 sessions, 2 sessions. This is the very last session that we're doing. This is the grand finale here. So it's sort of like you hype it up a bit. And yeah, things might not live up to the hype, but at least everybody is there and they know the ending is. Like if you know something is ending and you miss that session, you'll be like, oh, geez, if I had known that was happening, I would have rearranged my schedule to come out for that. So I think the players do like an ending, and it is very satisfactory to actually have that happen. So yeah, that's my recommendation is to have a good ending.
I would absolutely agree.
Sorry, I've never experienced an ending to a campaign before. They've only ever fizzled out, usually because somebody moved away. Usually
I guess on that topic then, how do you kind of plan out the number of sessions that you think your campaign is going to take, and more importantly, how do you make sure that you don't end up in that TV series that gets canceled midway through season 2 and they have to wrap it up real quick?
I think we've been doing this for a few years with Paul's group, and I didn't used to do this. I just found that at first I ran Star Wars a couple of years ago, and I think I ended up near 25 sessions, and I kept track of them because I would write out each session as a chapter in a story. But having being in video and film, I've tried to do that a little bit more to sort of mimic that beginning, middle, and end, act 1, 2, and 3 of different stories. So I can sort of fudge it a little bit as I'm going. I'll be like, okay, well, this is sort of act 1. This is okay. Now we're going into act 2, act 3. Okay, yeah, I can wrap this up in like 3, 4, 5 sessions, kind of thing. So I'm just sort of guesstimating. But the closer I get to the end, the more I can define it down as to what I need to wrap it up, kind of thing. And that just takes place over time. I mean, everybody knows that everybody's heard of the thing. Well, yeah, there might be a show get canceled and they have to wrap it up in a 2-hour movie. How are they going to do that? They got to do it. They're told to do it. And it might not be the most satisfactory ending, but at least it's an ending. At least it's something. It doesn't just fizzle out. That's the worst, when a show gets canceled and you don't know what happens to anything else. So that's the one thing to try and avoid, because everybody's having fun and then all of a sudden it just drops off a cliff and you're like, I just want to know what the ending is. So it's just something to be learned over time, I guess. But even if you say, this is going to be 10 sessions, you can sort of map that out. Be like, okay, first 3 sessions, we're going to concentrate on this. Middle three, we really get into the guts of it. Last 2-3 sessions, I got to wrap it up here. So I got to pull things together. But if you have that structure can actually help you pull those things together to connect the dots on it. So I find that it helps in that way to actually confine it to a rough number of sessions kind of thing.
This is more of a personal question though. Do you tend to have kind of different endings in mind as you go through, or do you not really worry about it until it's an issue?
That's a really good question, because when I do it, I'll sometimes picture some kind of an ending and be like, okay, well, this thing should be happening at the ending. This event, this person should be there, or something along those lines. But it's very changeable. In the Star Wars one that I ran, they actually drastically changed my storyline. They went on they actually strafed the bad guy, and it completely changed it because that bad guy's now dead. And that was supposed to be the main one that they confronted at the end. Well, now I have to completely change how it goes. But it actually made for a better story because it made me think about it in a different way. And then I started adding other elements because I still had other things going on. So I just had to work with that. But I found that it was actually a good thing to do, that it actually did force me to change what I was doing. So it's being malleable to that ending as well as to where that is. My Cthulhu one was a little bit closer to what I was perceiving, I guess, when I thought of it. But again, the players still changed things in different ways that just made it a lot more interesting. So it's a bit of both. It's having things in mind, but then being able to shift and change it as the players change it. So it's a bit of both.
I think certain games also lean into it. I would say Call of Cthulhu is a game that usually will have an ending.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's not always the ending you want.
Yeah.
But I'd say that because of the nature of the game, the creatures or the mystery you're trying to solve is probably not something you can touch. Then by the time you do, you're done. So there's usually a pre-ending. Whereas other games tend to not necessarily make it as easy. So that comes back to what Dwayne was saying, is that having that. But Bill, the other thing I'd say is, like, if you know you have a deadline, like a baby, then you know that you can only write stories or do stories up to a certain point. So planning back from that is actually kind of helpful in some context. Is like, or you're always going to be busy at summer, so you can't do role playing. So like wrapping it up like that, because that's usually what slows it down.
I gotta say, I've become really mercenary over the years about ending. I tend to write my campaigns like a series of novels. So like a novel has a beginning, middle, and end. And then as the characters ramp up, you tend to have these plateaus, natural endpoints. And if the players start to say, and I've told my players, if you're ever like, hey, we need to change, don't feel like playing anymore, tell me. And then what I will do is I will crank that ending up. So instead of thinking about, okay, what's the next book in the series? It's like, okay, this is the end. Great. Take it to 11, dial it right up, and give them a really spectacular send-off. But I've literally, like, whenever I'm planning out a campaign, I'm like, I have multiple endpoints in mind, where I'm like, if this has to be the finale, great. 3 more adventures, we're out, and here's how we can write it out.
I think the other thing that Paul hinted at there, is understanding where your players are in the game. In Britain, people just tell you. In Canada, it's hard to extract out of them what they're thinking. They say, yeah, it's fine, it's good. Okay. But you have to think of novel ways necessarily to actually understand how a person's life is going and whether they want to put their time into this game. So I think, and not taking it personal in that context. I'm not saying you do a survey, but like you probably do have to dig a little bit with your players about when are they running out of steam, or maybe you've done too much combat or those sorts of things. I'm not sure I've usually found when you ask at the end of the session how people thought the game went, unless you ask specific questions. What was your favorite moment? What was the moment that you were kind of bored? Having to get really to pointed questions allows you to sometimes understand where people are. But the other thing Dwayne mentioned was write-ups. Write-ups are really important because, like, when I think of the gaming group we have, we play one set of games for a period of time and then we change to something else. The chances are we may go back to the other game. Like, I'm very happy to go back and do, say, certain campaigns. I just wanted to pause at that point. So write-ups are really helpful when you haven't played it for 6 months. Where the hell were we? So that's definitely something. Sometimes I get players to write up. Sometimes I'll get to write up. But also what it gives Dwayne is the ability to go back and look at, how did this turn out? What did I get right and what did I get wrong? Where did we go off the rails? And actually look at the story and then give you a sense of, that didn't work, but that did work. And then you get better at it, like whenever you do reflect on anything in life.
Thinking about endings too, if we think about favorite TV shows or movie series or things, everybody knows when it's jumped the shark, right? Like, we all have had that experience of, why are they doing another season of this? Like, they were done at the end of that last season, right? Being able to look at your own campaign through those eyes and say, wait a minute, we're done. There's no more adventure here. We've answered the big questions. We've killed the big bad. We've solved the mystery. Let's be done, right? And knowing that you're coming to a point where that could happen, as a GM, being comfortable in saying, and now we're finished, right, is a really tricky one, because you want your players to be really satisfied. And I'll say, like, leave them wanting more. They'll come back and play with you again, as opposed to dragging something on until they die of boredom. Like that's no one's playing another game with you for a while after that, right? So
I think that's a good point. We were talking about these sort of like great difference between an adventure and a campaign. Well, I think the actual more important difference is between a campaign and sandbox, where it's an open world. And that's where you can get caught up, where you're just playing it and there's no real ending ever. And whereas in a campaign, that's a definitive story from beginning to end, where it should have an ending in there. So I think that's the more crucial difference, is whether you want a sandbox game that just goes in different directions and may or may not actually have an ending, rather than having an adventure or a campaign where it probably should have an ending of some sort.
I think also to be careful on that, a sandbox game is probably the thing that a GM should do.
Yes.
Don't do a campaign, because again, like, thinking that you have to think through all of this and how it's going to end and the possible different endings is kind of overwhelming for anyone.
Yeah.
And most of us don't want to do that.
Yeah.
If we did, we would write books or write for TV. So I think the differentiation is that you can do that, and it could emerge into a campaign as you get more clarity about, oh, this is what I want to do and this is what the players want to do.
Or to do a module when you're starting out, a pre-written module or a scenario is, either of those two ways. They're either sandbox it or some combination of doing some pre-written scenarios by someone else.
And I feel like with the sandbox, one way that you can get experience to apply to building campaigns, which is kind of what Bill was commenting on right at the beginning, is like, I got practice because I got a bunch of different pre-written scenarios that I had to somehow weave together to make them seem coherent, right? So kind of starting in the same place, bringing back the same NPC characters, replacing some from the pre-gen. And so that, I think now that we've been talking, I feel like that has given me some basic experience that I can then turn into building a campaign.
So I know we're coming up on an hour and we're talking about endings. So I think that's a really good segue, but I actually want to take us back to the beginning, if you don't mind. So I have a real quick question of mostly just how you frame the discussion with the players in terms of that ending. Do you talk about the end of the player character at the end of the campaign, or do you continue the player characters past a particular campaign, I guess is the question.
I think it depends. We tend to, in our group, after we're done playing a game for 6 to 8 months, we tend to shift to another game and another GM. and we have about 3, now 4 GMs, so we're always shifting. So it might be, a year and a half, 2 years before you run a game again. So the choice is whether they want to go back to that. Maybe. I think we've talked about it. We haven't actually done it yet. We keep going into new games, but it is a possibility. I'm open either way. Paul, you probably have words on that too.
Generally speaking, I find that most games the players tend to reach the end of the game system, or where the best and most fun part of the game system ends. And at that point, it's usually not worth going on much further. It's more interesting to start new characters. And I like to give them an ending which is so spectacular that they actually want to leave it alone. I mean, that's always my goal. Do I succeed? But that's definitely the goal, where it's like they feel like I am satisfied. My character had an arc, we had an adventure, we are done, and now I can start something new. I very rarely go back to those characters. And I play a lot of D&D, and I find when characters hit that 12th to 15th level, the game doesn't scale well beyond that. So then it's all of a sudden you're like fighting on alternate planes against weird stuff that makes no sense to anybody. And at that point, I as a DM kind of run out of steam on ideas. So I like to end it at that point. So yeah, I don't tend to go back.
And I guess to clarify, do you have that conversation with the players ahead of time, or do you kind of leave that to naturally happen?
I think it's a combination of the two for me. I try to gauge where the players are. Usually you can find, like, if they're beginning to wane, or they're starting to get tired of their characters, or they feel like they're not doing anything new, at that point, I'll force the issue. I'll be like, okay, we're going to be wrapping this up in a couple of sessions. And because one of the things about being a GM or DM in a game is that you invest a lot of time and effort into it. And you have to also stop when it's not fun for you anymore, because your players will sense that, and then they will stop having fun too. So again, find the high note, and pick it. And because you're kind of responsible for that as the leader of the group, then make it happen. And yeah, you can get buy-in from your players. You absolutely should talk to them anyway. And yeah, and see how it goes. It's a little organic.
I think it also, again, depends on the game, doesn't it? Like,
yeah.
Well, you must be done for Dungeons and Dragons up to certain levels. Like, you've done it so many times. I think of it's an unusual set of circumstances, but I have a D&D character that I play at Gen Con. So I get to play it for maybe 4 to 12 hours every year. And I'm kind of like, who is this person? But this character doesn't feel done yet because it hasn't explored all the things, or it hasn't explored enough of the things, is probably a fair, accurate statement. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of people do like to create new characters. I don't play the same game often. So there's some games I've iterated, but I've not done Dungeons and Dragons for 30 years. I've probably done it for 4, maybe 5 max. And then the rest are different games. But I think, back to Bill's point, talking to the player around it, because it depends what your agenda is. Is your agenda that you want to start from scratch? For whatever reason, maybe it's like you tried this out, it feels like they're overpowered now because you don't know how to GM that level yet. And you may say, hey, I want to repeat it again. It's a bit like when you're playing a computer game. Sometimes you do the first bit multiple times, then you think, oh, I got this now. And then eventually you feel good with it. Like I think of Divinity, amount of times I've started different characters in that. And then eventually you get one character you want to stick with and finish it. But I think that's probably the conversation you have is,
and some games are,
what do they want?
Yeah, and some games are more geared to having levels, whereas you think of something like Call of Cthulhu, there's not levels that you go up. You get better in skills, but you're not going to go up in levels. So you could actually play a different scenario in that, and it'd be like a sequel to a movie kind of thing. You have a new story, same characters, and they're not overpowered or anything like that. They're slightly better than they were before. But if you can come up with something that's new and interesting and fun and engaging, that's the main thing.
Cool. So
I will say we had one comment in our chat apparently
was it,
about
Dwayne?
session zeros. And it's my old friend Chris, who said that he actually does a short questionnaire prior to starting a campaign with his players. So that's an interesting thing for a session zero, actually having them fill out a questionnaire.
I like that. That's a good suggestion.
Yeah, shout out to Chris on that one.
So what is one thing that everyone's taking away from here that they didn't know before? Do Stephanie or Bill want to start? And then Dwayne and Paul, think about, is there something that you didn't think about before?
I can start. I love two suggestions. I love the idea of having a set number of sessions in mind. I feel like that also gets more buy-in from players. Like they're committing, like, yes, we're planning to do this for 6 months or whatever, and this is how often we're going to play. I feel like a lot of times things peter out because nobody knows when the end date is, and so they're just kind of like, well, I can't keep doing this forever. And then I love the idea of breaking it into acts. And I don't know very much about what you were talking about doing with like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So I could probably do some searching on, how like a TV script or movie script is put together with the 3 acts. But I can certainly talk about what that's like for a trilogy, because I feel like every book now is a trilogy, so I've read a lot of them. Like the first one is the hook and the getting to know the characters. The second one is usually the most painful book that you kind of have to push through, because it's just a lot of like building up skills and ability, and then the last one is the big finale where most of the questions are answered. Not all of them, but most of them are answered. And so that in itself is giving me more confidence walking into this of, I don't have to have a whole outline, but having an idea of like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and how many each one is going to take, it makes this process feel a lot less overwhelming. So that's what I'm going to take away.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me as well. And I think importantly, I want to call out again kind of what we touched on at the very beginning, is that like, Steph, you felt like you didn't have it together in terms of piecing these scenarios together into a broader campaign, and as a player I had no idea. And so as a GM, I think that boosts my confidence a little bit of I don't have to have everything laid out ahead of time. I just have to have a general plan. I don't even have to have the whole plan yet, just enough of the pieces to keep things moving along, and maybe a few elements that tie the world together. And that helps alleviate some of the stress, I guess.
That's good to hear, Bill, because I like that. I always stay away from the term world building, and I always prefer scene building, because that just means that's immediately what you're doing. That's the session that you're playing that night. You prepare for that session. You still have all the history of all the other sessions. You still have, some general ideas of where it's going to go, but you're ultimately preparing for that session right then and there. And to me, it makes it a little bit less daunting, because you're just there to make that one fun, and then you go on to the next one and you do the same thing. And to me, it helps pare it down a little bit more. So I guess I should say what I learned. So what I liked hearing about was from Steph and Bill, and just hearing about starting off again, because it's been a few decades since I was in there. And I think when I was younger, playing in more of that sandbox mode where we were just playing around in it, and not really having endings, not really having a whole lot of structure, still having fun, just enjoying it, doing different scenarios, trying different things out. But it's actually seeing the thought processes and the concerns about it, and putting myself back into that space, I think is helpful, because from a GM looking at other players and playing with other players, I can see it from that perspective, and it does help in terms of being a GM and being a player in that way.
It's funny because I feel very similar to what you said, Dwayne. Like, I loved getting Stephanie and Bill your perspectives, because it reminds me that I want more people to DM or GM games. And if it seems intimidating to do, and people are afraid to do it or aren't quite sure how to jump in, I kind of forgotten that that's a barrier, right? And I love to play games as much as I like to run them. And I'd like to have more people who are comfortable running games so that I can do that. So yeah, so it's kind of fun to say, okay, if these are the stumbling blocks, great. How do we get those out of the way? So yeah.
I want to say I didn't like what Bill and Stephanie did to give variety, but I did. I think that it's one of the reasons that we're doing this is to have questions and perspectives from different kind of experiences. I think the biggest reminder for me was about endings. I find that working in technology, people keep moving all the time. So you have transient relationships, although you keep them afterwards. But for role playing around a table, although in COVID times, that's not happening as much. Boo to COVID for many reasons, but that's definitely one of them. But I think thinking about the endings and setting timings is something that I think is really, really helpful. But I also like I think there's so much weight around the concept of campaign that people are scared of it. And hopefully we've talked a little bit about so that there's less fear about it. About how you break it down and actually not worry about it as much. Cool. Okay. I'm going to say goodbye if we can all wave, and then I'll turn off the live streaming. Bye-bye.